Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Natasha Bertrand. I'm a national security reporter with CNN. And here we have the Secretary of State for Defense, Ben Wallace. We have the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Sweden, Tobias Billström. And we have the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Romania, Luminița Odobescu. The Minister of Defense for the Netherlands, Kajsa Ollongren, will be joining us shortly. And with that, I think we can just begin here. So I want to start with you, Secretary Wallace. So NATO's strategic concept, which was adopted last year, it reiterates NATO's open door policy. And you said recently that whenever this conflict finishes, we should be prepared as quickly as possible to bring Ukraine into NATO. But the communique that was released yesterday, it said that Ukraine can only join NATO when, quote, conditions are met. So what are those conditions? Can you elaborate a bit?
Well, first of all, the condition that I think everyone agrees, and has been quite a long-running condition, is for any nation that wants to join, we don't want to import a conflict into an Article 5 issue straight into the NATO alliance. And I think that's been pretty clear. The Ukrainians have always understood that, and I think that's the reality. But you know, we shouldn't miss the point that more than the 31 members of NATO, soon to be 32, nearly 50 nations have been supporting Ukraine to be successful in this conflict. So I think that condition is an understandable position. I think what people sort of have missed about yesterday's communique, and indeed the broader issue, is that there is now a complete acceptance that Ukraine will join NATO. It's not an if anymore, but it is a when. And I understand, you know, President Zelensky's impatience on, I want a timetable. I think that's what he talked about. But ultimately, culturally, it is accepted that Ukraine will join NATO. When that happens is either condition-based, also before this invasion, Britain with Sweden, Canada, the United States were invested in Ukraine and building their capabilities. Now, I don't think we have to challenge Ukraine's capabilities anymore. They're, sadly, for the wrong reasons, well exercised, equipped and trained. But ultimately, I think it is an important position that we recognize that NATO, and the Secretary General was pretty clear on that, it's about a when, not an if.
So I understand, obviously, the argument that Ukraine cannot join NATO until the war with Russia ends. But isn't that kind of incentivizing Russia to never pull its troops out of Ukraine? Doesn't this create a very acute strategitic dilemma for NATO?
Look, I don't think Russia are heading towards a position where they're going to be able to choose. They might be able to choose to hold on, to sort of barricade themselves into Crimea, but at the moment, and despite some of the media coverage, you know, Ukraine is advancing every day. It might not be advancing to timetable that people might have predicted, but it is capturing ground every day. It is costing the Russians to hold it. And what we've seen, as we saw specifically, for example, when Prigozhin made his dash from Moscow, there is precious little Russian reserve for now available. So I don't think Russia has necessarily got the luxury to sit behind some defensive. It tried that, and it's now there's a counteroffensive, and Ukraine is making slow but sure successes. So I don't think what's going on in the minds of the Kremlin is that type of rational discussion. I certainly don't think he has the luxury to do that.
So your belief is that they can't just wait it out?
No, I think they are in a position where the attrition rates for the Russian forces are difficult. And yes, Russia has scale on its side. It can generate or try to regenerate its industrial base. It can resupply. It can send more young men to their deaths in the way they do. But ultimately, I think we should be more optimistic. We should also reflect on our own weaknesses that not many people that I've met, well, everyone I met underestimated Ukraine from day one. And I think that continues in that same light, that Ukraine has a lot more punch in it. It hasn't committed its reserves, and those reserves are going to be vital for the next stage. So I think we should just give them that headspace. We'll continue to support. You know, the announcements from many nations today and yesterday about further munitions and support, I think puts us in a pretty good, strong position. And, you know, Russia is feeling it. Some of the deep strikes that we've seen in open source have been significant stocks of their ammunition and logistics.
So sticking with you for a second, so the G7, they're going to announce today a new framework for guaranteeing Ukraine's long-term security. This sounds a lot like the kind of security guarantees that Ukraine was hoping for? Can you give us a little preview of what's...
No, I'll let you announce it. I mean, all to say is that, yeah, there's lots of layers to security guarantees, and one of them is to build the capacity and internationalize the requirements that Ukraine would need. It will need safer skies, it will need safer borders, and making sure that there's an international contribution to that within Ukraine will be quite important.
So moving on to Minister Billström, so on Monday, we saw Erdogan suggest that he would not move Sweden's NATO accession forward unless Turkey was also admitted into the EU. Just a few hours later, there was a complete turnaround, and somehow there was this deal struck whereby Turkey would allow Sweden to move forward. So how was this very abrupt turnaround actually achieved in the 11th hour here?
Well, I think you partly have to ask a question to President Erdogan and perhaps not to me, but as far as I can see, we stand on a very firm basis of the fact that we, since the last summit of NATO in Madrid, have fulfilled all the commitments that we made within the trilateral memorandum signed by Sweden, Finland and Turkey. And within that memorandum, specifically, there was written aspects concerning the security of Turkey in relation to PKK activities, which sometimes have had their basis in Sweden. We have, throughout these 12 months that has passed since the summit in Madrid, worked tirelessly together with the security agencies of Turkey, police authorities in Sweden, prosecutor's office, intelligence services, to see to it that we fulfill our commitments and take the security situation and the security concerns of Turkey seriously. That was specifically brought up at the meeting between President Erdogan, Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, I was present myself, and the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. After that, at that meeting, we decided to produce a new statement where we will enter, Sweden will enter, into a strategic compact together with Turkey in order to see to it that we continue these aspects of cooperation, which is also, incidentally, something which Sweden is very keen about, because within this framework we also bring forward the question of organized crime, which is a problem for my country, and which sometimes means that people who are being harbored or at least being present in Turkey are directing activities of organized crime on our territory. Now, we are very keen to get rid of that, but we can't do it without cooperating with Turkish authorities. So I would say that this is continuing to be a joint venture. I would also say that I think that our Turkish counterparts found the result of this cooperation so far pleasing.
And was this deal tied to the provision of American F-16 fighter jets to Turkey? I mean, what do you say to critics who say that this was essentially a quid pro quo with regard to the provision of weapons to Turkey for them to lift their hold?
Well, I think that President Biden has spoken very openly about a deal being presented which entailed both Turkey, Greece and the United States. But regardless of that, this was always a or perhaps a trilateral thing between those countries. It's not something which concerns Sweden. We have never been part of such a deal. We have not been involved with it. It's only a question for those states. However, if it was beneficiary to bringing Turkey closer to a decision to start the ratification process of Sweden's NATO accession, we are of course pleased and proud. And I think that this is good in itself. But I think one is making a mistake if one looks only at those aspects and forget the fact that this was a two-tier process. Without us taking into consideration the security concerns of Turkey, I don't think that this process would have moved forward, honestly.
And I do want to introduce the Minister of Defense for the Netherlands, Kajsa Ollongren. Thank you for joining us. Briefly, though, I want to go back to Minister Odobescu, and I want to ask, going back to Ukraine, about F-16 fighter jet training for the Ukrainians, because Romania is going to set up a hub, a center for that training after a big coalition of countries agreed to set up this training for Ukrainian pilots on F-16s and other kinds of fighter jets. So can you just talk a little bit about when you actually expect the training for those pilots to begin? What stage of the process are we in right now?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, which is very timely. Before starting, maybe a word of from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea, a word of congratulations for our host, for our ally and partner, Lithuania, for organizing this important summit. Yes, you know that Romania supported and will continue to support Ukraine. This is very important, and not only for the Euro-Atlantic aspiration. This is, I think, the main results of today's summit, besides the strengthening the defense and deterrence in the eastern flank. And I think there are a lot of concrete results, and I will come back to your question, because it's very important to discuss what happens between Madrid and Vilnius. And we had a very important concept in Madrid, the strategic concept. We should remember that it came at a moment of tectonic shift in the Euro-Atlantic security. But also for my country, this was really a big achievement. And because Romania, as other countries in our region, were fully integrated in the alliance, fully interoperable with alliance, but not only benefited from NATO alliance, being an important contributor. So this is essential. I want to start to underline. I want to underline this important aspect for my country, because this concept now we are discussing what means in practice. And in Vilnius, we expected, of course, the implementation of the strategic concept, but also we have new decision to adapt NATO to the current complex environment we are living in, and speaking about the complex security environment. And of course, one of the decisions in the margin is for Romania and our alliance was to set up this hub. And now we are coordinating with our alliance. It was signed a statement yesterday to start the whole process. So we are at the beginning of the process. Yeah.
And have you received permission from the US at this point to actually begin the training on the F-16 fighter jets? Because obviously it is a US.
Yes, US is our partner, so we are coordinated with our allies.
Okay.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us. So I just want to turn to you now, Minister Ollongren. So the Netherlands has also been a key part of this coalition for the F-16s. And I know you spoke a little bit about this yesterday in terms of the fact that the Netherlands is going to be sending some of its F-16s to Romania for training the pilots. But will you be sending F-16s to the Ukrainians once they're actually finished training on them?
Yeah. Well, thank you, and sorry that I was late. Let me say something about this coalition. 11 countries, all countries present here are part of that coalition, even UK and Sweden, who don't fly F-16s. So that shows how important this is to all of us, and also that we need everybody's expertise in this project. It's really a complex project, but we're making it happen. The trainings are going to start in Denmark in August, and then thanks to Romania, who is willing to host the hub, the training center, we will be able to continue in a sustainable way in Romania for Ukraine, but also for other countries who are transitioning to the fourth generation fighter jets, like Romania itself and others. And I think that is a very important part of our partnership with Ukraine, and also showing the strength of unity, and that we have to cooperate. And that would be my second point. As we're all strengthening our defense, we are increasing our budgets, we've agreed to the 2% pledge, it means we will all be investing. But we all know that we have to coordinate our efforts more. I think, and I really believe, we also have to integrate our cooperation further. The Netherlands, for instance, has a very strong integration with Germany when it comes to the army, with the UK when it comes to our Marines, the Navy with Belgium. We are so much stronger if we do that. And being 31, 32, and in the future 33 countries in NATO, we have to make sure that 1 + 1 is not 2, but that it is more than that. And that is something that I think also looking from the European perspective, having a more balanced NATO, where we of course will always, the US will always be our most important partner and the strongest country, but we also have to live up to that expectation that we also are strong in Europe. Because if you look at NATO, it was created because of the threat of the Soviet Union. And we are now waking up to Russian aggression and Russian threat in many years to come, I fear. So stepping that up and making sure that we are as integrated as possible, and perhaps later on we could also talk a little bit about industry that we need in this respect is something that I'm working on every day.
So has the Netherlands made a decision yet about whether it wants to send F-16s to Ukraine?
Well, on the F-16s, I mean, it's a sorry that I didn't answer your question, but on the F-16s, we've started the training trajectory, and if you train Ukrainian pilots and Ukrainian personnel and engineers on F-16 and on this specific capability, then of course the perspective has to be that at some point they will be able to use the capability. But it does require a separate decision because, as you said, it is an American system. So when Washington gave the green light for the training, that's when we could, the things that we were already preparing, we could really put it in place. But to deliver the actual capability itself needs a separate decision and a separate green light by Washington. And so that's the next step.
Is Washington dragging its feet on that, or have you submitted the request yet to Washington for the ability to transfer?
I wouldn't say that Washington is dragging its feet. I think we're all looking on how this is developing, and we are now taking this step. And that means that at some point in time, we will look at how to take the next step.
Okay. And how long do you anticipate, just to stick with this question because it's so important for the Ukrainians, how long do you anticipate the training will actually take on these systems? A matter of months, a year?
Of course, we don't really know. It is new. We think that in 6 to 8 months, the training could be done for the pilots. Of course, for the engineers and all the personnel you need, we don't really know. It depends a little bit on language skills. It depends on how experienced are these pilots. We know the Ukrainians as very quick learners, but I mean, we've seen it with Patriots, for instance, which is also quite complicated. But 6 to 8 months is really, really fast.
So I want to move on to the question of cluster munitions and what it says about the gap that we are now seeing in ammunition supplies to Ukraine. President Biden said last week that there is a stockpile issue here, that the U.S. is running low on certain kinds of ammunition, and that in order to fill that gap, the U.S. does need to provide cluster munitions to Ukraine. Now, 3 of the 4 countries sitting here have banned cluster munitions. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, and I'll start with you, Secretary Wallace, to the decision by the U.S. to send these munitions. Do you agree with it, or do you think it was a mistake?
Well, look, from a military point of view, the Ukrainians needed munitions to shift Russians out of those defensive lines. Cluster munitions, as originally designed, were designed for some of those purposes, as they were for shutting down runways. Back to the 1980s, they were the drive towards the treaty was driven actually by the likes of Russia using them against civilian targets, and the inappropriate use of them. Like any weapon system, actually, you prosecute that against civilians, you break Geneva Conventions, you break international law, you end up with nations around here saying, actually, we've just got to try and finish it. So at one level, I understand the military requirement that the Ukrainians were facing. The United States are not a signatory to that treaty, right? So it frees them up to do what they feel is right. And, so I'm not a lawyer, but in a legal position, if you were to, if you're not a signatory to that treaty, and if those munitions are used legitimately against a military target, I think that is it's a matter for the US lawyers, but ultimately I don't think it's not against the conventions of war, it's how you use weapon systems. But in our nations, we've signed the treaty, we feel that we can't champion the use of them, we can't propose them, we can't promote them, we can't support them, we can't assist them, and that is the bounds of them. But the more general question of, is there a stockpile issue? Well, ultimately, as I said earlier, the supplying of equipment to Ukraine has been huge, vast. I think they prepared 12 brigades for this offensive. 12 brigades is bigger than most people's armies, right? It's vast. I don't have 12 brigades, right? So 12 effectively armor brigades prepared for this counteroffensive, mainly out of gifted equipment and donations. And this is a long war of attrition. And one of the lessons from Ukraine is we were very much poised in NATO for an offensive and a defense, which is our main goal, around night one, day one, as we called it. In night one, day one, we were all always focused in removing air defenses and removing air threats so we could prosecute wars at leisure. And no one had really asked themselves the question, well, what if day one, night one becomes week 2, week 3, week 4? How much of our exquisite capabilities have we actually got in stock? And I think that's been the broader question. This is a prolonged conflict. Huge amounts of munitions are being fired and used, and we're all struggling to find ways of keeping that going. Now, how you address that as an individual nation is a matter for that nation. Obviously, I heard the position of the United States. For us, we've just started buying production line places to manufacture 155 shells, of which some of those manufacturers will go to Ukraine. All of us have had to struggle stimulating our supply chains, some of which went to sleep. When we put the NLAWs, the Saab, Thales, British, Swedish anti-tank missile, some of the supply chain had been asleep for 5 years. We'd bought our 4,000 or 5,000 or whatever we had all those years ago. And, supply chains don't stay open for nothing. They go and do something else. And I think when we signed a new contract with Finland and Sweden to buy a good few thousand more or maybe this year or end of the year, the reason it took time, and I was criticised in Parliament, was we had to find a new supply chain. And so I think it's a general challenge, munition levels. Of course it will be in this war, and every nation will find a way of filling that gap. Now, the United States took that decision. I don't know the secret levels of American munitions. It's not my business. It's for them, and I would keep mine secret. And so they're just finding ways around the challenge.
So do you think it was necessary at this point in the war?
I mean, we're signatory to the treaty. We can't promote or support cluster munitions. What I can say is, I understand the military logic of a range of munitions that would be required to get through those front lines. A range of munitions. The US clearly looked at it, made a decision, and they're not a signature to the treaty. So.
Minister Ollongren, as the other defense minister here, I would love to get your thoughts, because obviously Netherlands is also a signatory to this ban.
I very much agree with Ben. This is exactly, we are in the same position. We signed a treaty. We don't have cluster munition. We will not donate cluster munition. We will abide by the treaty. And my analysis would be exactly this. So being in this war of attrition, knowing that the enemy is using cluster munition and even worse, I would say, than that. This is a solution between two countries that did not sign the treaty, that we cannot vocally support in any way, but that is explicable from a military perspective.
It does raise one challenge, which is, we should also remember as an alliance, we can't just take for granted relying on nations who didn't sign a treaty or don't have a capability, right? Because what is clear is we don't have in our inventories at the moment the necessary munitions to shut down airfields and break through lines that we might have done in the old days. One of my challenges now to my industry and to the department is we see the Ukrainians struggle to shut down runways, right? The Storm Shadow is a deep strike weapon, but it is not designed to destroy runways, right? It's designed to destroy headquarters and bunkered things, etc., etc. So, what have I got in my weapon stock should we find ourselves in a conflict to shut down a runway? So I think it goes back to, if you can't use cluster munitions, because we've all quite rightly signed this treaty, you need to innovate and come up with something else. And I think that's just exposed that challenge. That's the challenge the Ukrainians have.
And of course, the one reason, I think the main reason for many countries to sign this treaty is because we know that cluster munition makes many civilian casualties. That is the big issue. That is what we really want to avoid. We know that Russia is not bothered by these things. They're making civilian casualties on purpose every day.
We have about 5 minutes left before we go to the audience for questions, but I wanted to talk about the nuclear question. And the NATO strategic concept for last year says that strategic stability delivered through effective deterrence and defense, arms control and disarmament, and meaningful and reciprocal political dialogue remains essential to our security. So has the alliance communicated clearly to Russia clear consequences should it take that step of using a nuclear weapon? And obviously we are now seeing growing concerns that they are preparing to move their tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. So maybe, Minister Odobescu, you could speak to this a little bit about your concerns.
Maybe just one question. I think the one answer to the previous question, because I think the focus is now how we can scale up practically to increase our defense industry to support Ukraine. And I will say what we are doing at the level of the EU, because this is a tremendous work to put together important financial resources through the European Peace Facility, to the European Fund, also to increase the production in Europe, which is not always easy. To support Ukraine, and we have a lot of new initiative, which is new at the EU level, in supporting the production, in supporting Ukraine. So this is also, I think, it's very important. With respect to your question, yes, I think it's visible already, and it is already reflected in the communiqué of this summit. The risks we are facing in the nuclear area. So, of course, we are all concerned about this, and we stay together. I think unity and coordination among us, also through our discussions, but also in the public speeches, because it's practically we have the war at our borders, few kilometers away. And all the eastern flank is directly affected, but not only the eastern flank, it's the whole Europe, and this is a serious issue we have to discuss, and what is important is that it was correctly, timely reflected in this Vilnius summit.
Minister Billström, your thoughts? I mean, how are the allies, soon to be ally, how are you grappling with the possibility of Belarus storing Russian tactical nuclear weapons on its soil? Like, how is NATO dealing with that possibility?
First of all, this is, of course, a serious question. It would have been serious to Sweden, regardless of whether we are in NATO or not. That needs to be stated clearly, I think. However, I think that NATO simply has to do what we are already doing, namely to stand up in favor of both the values, which we are all in favor of, and try to also make that clear to a public audience, which is not only the EU or the NATO or the West, but also the global South. This is an international question. The use of nuclear weapons is always a very serious matter, regardless of any time we are living in. And we can just, today, or tonight, we saw the launch of an interballistic missile, the test from North Korea. That is also something to weigh into this discussion. So I don't think that we should limit ourselves to just a discussion about moving things to Belarus. This question is much larger. And the NATO has to send a consistent message to Russia, to Belarus, to North Korea, to all states who are even thinking about using nuclear weapons, what the consequences would be for all of us. And I think that message is being broadcasted very clearly.
Secretary Wallace, there have been some reports that the US, UK, and other allies, they communicated very clearly to Russia that there would be kinetic consequences, that there would be military action in response to Russia using a tactical nuclear weapon or a strategic nuclear weapon, but more likely tactical in Ukraine. Can you confirm that there have been those communications to the Russians?
No, I think what we made very clearly, publicly and privately, is there would be severe consequences. It's not to our advantage to be specific, but also I don't think it was us alone. It wasn't the P3 of NATO alone. It wasn't Britain, France, and the United States, who are the three nuclear powers in NATO. I think we saw, and also slightly publicly, both China and India being pretty direct towards the Kremlin about what it thought of the threats. And I think we saw as a consequence, actually, at that time, a de-escalation of that rhetoric and indeed Russia's desire or potential desire to use, I hate calling it a tactical nuclear weapon because it is anything but a nuclear weapon. And we saw that obviously the new flank is the Belarusian flank, which I think is actually, it'll be interesting what the president of Belarus really thinks, because he should be under no illusion. These are not Belarusian nuclear weapons. These are Russian nuclear weapons on his soil. And I would like to be a fly on the wall to understand exactly how much say he would really get. So I think it's much a question for him about his sovereign state as anything else. But of course it's a worry. But it's actually why NATO is a nuclear alliance, right? You know, I've always thought it, you know, since 1991, we all got out of practice, right? You know, Britain is a nuclear power. Of course, we have regular anti-nuclear debates, but not many. There's pretty much a all-party consensus in favour, except the Scottish National Party. But ultimately, if you don't continue the conversation with your own population, they will wake up surprised that you, A, have nuclear weapons, and B, that there is a threat. And I think Putin's done another favour to us all. He's reminded many of us the value of a nuclear deterrent because of his rhetoric. You know, he is the single man responsible for Sweden's entry, I think, into NATO. I mean, you know, he has been the best recruiting sergeant for NATO, and he has. I hope he goes home at night and realises he is 100% to blame, and is no one else. So I think ultimately we have to remind the population of NATO. We are a nuclear deterrent alliance. We believe in that as a defence and deterrence. It's why we should be not as worried as we could have been with the Belarusian threat. And ultimately, you know, we invest heavily in that capability. And allies who don't possess nuclear weapons, however, exercise in facilitating and supporting that happen, because we are an alliance ultimately of NATO. And, you know, sometimes nation members forget that and they start to think about signing treaties, and you're going, no, I don't really, you can't be in NATO and want to ban, or, you know, I mean, I think ultimately Putin has reminded us of the threats and how deterrent has a role.
Have you, just a quick follow-up, have you seen signs that that transfer of the nuclear weapons has begun to Belarus?
Well, I think we've seen open source reports about that. I think Putin's made his statements. He made it not so long ago. I think he said certain weapons had gone or were preparing to go or whatever.
He says a lot of things.
Yeah, the funny thing about Putin is, while he's got a reputation for lying, he actually doesn't always lie. He's actually, you know, he says, you know, one of the problems with this Ukraine was he was pretty clear in his essays what he thought he was going to do with Ukraine, and everyone ignored it. And he wrote that essay. Sometimes he doesn't lie on something.
So you have not seen signs, or you have seen signs?
I think we've seen in open source, obviously, signs of these things progressing.
Okay. Minister Ollongren, I do want to ask you, because you mentioned this earlier, the 2%. I want to finish on that, the 2% spending commitment. Now it seems that 2% is a floor, is now the minimum that allies are committing to spend in terms of their own defense budget. Do you believe that the Netherlands will get there? Do you have hope that the alliance as a whole will get there at some point, or is that 2% floor now too ambitious?
I mean, it's our commitment now. So we have to get there. And I'm really happy that as Netherlands we have anticipated, and next year we will be on the 2%. But it is something that has to, you know, you don't want to discuss it every year. And the 2% is, you have to translate it into real budget for years and years and years to come. Because that is the way you build strong armed forces, to have the predictability of being able to rely on that budget. This year, for instance, when we had to do budget cuts in the Netherlands, the Ministry of Defense was accepted from these budget cuts. And that is very important, that there is no political debate about the necessity of doing these 2% and not go under it. And I think that to have learned this lesson at some point at the end of the Cold War, I think it was normal that we decreased because the tension was off. But we have, in 2014, I think we all stepped up, but not enough. And that's why we have so much work to do now. And so, it's about people, it's about new capabilities, but it's also about all these enablers that you need now. So there is, even though we will reach the 2%, and our commitment is very firm to the 2% as a floor, we still have a lot of work to do.
When do you anticipate the Netherlands will reach that goal?
We will reach it next year.
Next year, okay.
And we will, and the year after, and we will also have elections. So, of course, that means that for the long run, that will be part of the political debate. But my plea will be that we have to, it's not only for the next years. It is for 10 or 20 years to come that we need this certainty.
Okay, well, with that, I want to open it up to audience questions. If you could, when I call on you, make your way to the microphone, and we'll do it like that. Yes.
Hello, my name is Elena Murzak from the Republic of Moldova. Of course, my question will go to Minister Odobescu regarding the situation and relation with the Republic of Moldova. Fortunately, we have a dedicated point in the summit communique, point 81, on the cooperation with the Republic of Moldova. Unfortunately, we know why. And my question is, what does it mean? Our public is interested. Practical support for the enhanced defense capacity building. This is the first question. And as well, President Iohannis referred to the support for the Republic of Moldova regarding the resilience. And how do you think if our national armies will work on the interoperability and how this process will be improved? Thank you.
One of the consequences of the war is the effects on the vulnerable partners and the Republic of Moldova, but not only Republic of Moldova. And for historical and traditional reasons, Republic of Moldova is a priority for Romania, and our support is done bilaterally at the EU level and also in NATO. I think the fact that we have advanced in the cooperation with NATO is a step forward. And this is very important, and we have decided just before coming to increase the Romanian contribution to the DCB package with €1 million in addition with what we have done before. This is very important, is we help Moldova to increase its resilience. And Moldova, Republic of Moldova faces a lot of difficulties, and it's not only the threat coming from Russia, because the reality is that Republic of Moldova faces now a hybrid war. And we put in place at the EU level, but also at the NATO level, instruments to support the Republic of Moldova. We have an initiative with France and Germany to support financially Republic of Moldova with all our partners. We put in place a sanction regime at the level of the EU for those acting against the democratic stability of Republic of Moldova. And what we have done here, it's practically a strong partnership with Republic of Moldova to increase its capability to defend itself and to face the difficulties in this very complex environment, because we are living around the Black Sea in a very complex environment, and the war is there, but also the consequences of the war in all areas. And I'm not speaking only about the effects of the war in terms of economic. I'm speaking about energy security, because Republic of Moldova faced blackmail from Russia in terms of cutting the energy, and then inflation is high there. So they need all our support to increase their resilience But when I'm speaking about resilience, it's really I'm speaking in a broader sense, and we ask all our partners, allies, to come together. And what we have done today with in the summit communique with an important paragraph for Republic of Moldova, I think it's a step forward.
Okay. I'll go there to the back.
Hello, Paul Sarautsas. I'm a journalist from Latvia. I have a question for Minister Wallace. President Zelensky has warned that the Russians may be planning to blow up the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Would you consider that as being equivalent to the use of a nuclear bomb?
I don't think you can crudely equivalent the two things. It would be obviously designed to generate a dirty bomb or a contagious. It would be, you know, another nail in the Russians' coffin of reputation around the world, that, you know, it's now got a strong reputation for war crimes, it's got a reputation for torture, rape, invading other countries. Not much left, it can go into the darkness, but that would be absolutely another final step towards its total isolation. And, you know, we see Russia try and counter by saying false flag all the time. It's trying to claim everyone's about to do this, and usually Britain's sometimes behind it, I notice, in Russian allegations. Of course, I think that just exposes how they are themselves, that, you know, the only false flag really comes out of Russia most of the time. And I think last time the international community, the IEA, did quite a lot of work in making sure there was some sort of reassurance around the international community about this. The power station itself, I think a number of the reactors are now shut down, so the risk is lower of the consequences than it might have been. But, you know, he should be very, very careful about playing with that capability. You know, this is nuclear power is often, it's not an individual country's responsibility, it's often an international communities, which is why the IEA is so important. And, you know, of course there would be consequences for doing something in that power station, but I'm not going to equate the two, between that and detonation of a nuclear weapon.
Have you seen preparations being made for that Russia is planning to attack the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant?
I'm not going to come and give you a running commentary of what I've seen and not seen. All I know is obviously, you know, in whose hands it currently is, and you know, we should just worry that, you know, it's in an invading country's hands, who has reputation for war crimes and atrocities. So, you know, that's got to worry us, whoever that, you know, is, and it happens to be Russia's doing it at the moment.
Okay, we have time, I think, for one more question. Yes.
Thank you very much, Alexei Goncharenko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine. You said about today we're waiting for the security guarantees, but the problem for Ukraine is that we already had it. It was called Budapest Memorandum, and the United Kingdom was one of the parties of these guarantees. And we now know what had happened. Nuclear Russia attacked our country. So now to fill this security vacuum that we have, it looks like we have just three ways. First of them, to become member of NATO with a nuclear powers in it. Unfortunately, after yesterday's decision, it looks uncertain, and we can't understand when it will happen. Number two, if one of the nuclear powers will deploy nuclear weaponry on our territory, Russia is deploying in Belarus. Why, for example, the United Kingdom or the United States can't deploy it in Ukraine on a bilateral basis? And the third opportunity is to restore our own nuclear arsenal. So what do you think about this? Thank you very much.
Well, look, first of all, look, there is a danger that we're undermining this communique, right? So I think you're wrong on your reading of the communique, right? I think it's my fourth or fifth NATO summit, right? I have watched the Ukraine conflict emerge at first hand. I believe that what the communique really says and what the Secretary General says, this is a matter of when. Right, we've crossed the other bridges that used to exist. There were nations who genuinely would say, well, if and should Ukraine really, does it really belong in NATO? I think we have crossed that bridge. The question is a debate about when, and Ukraine is absolutely right to press us on when there should be a timetable for Ukraine to join. So I don't read your interpretation the way you do. I read it, and you know, my Dutch colleague said 33. There you are. There's another example of the when, right? So I do believe there will be a time in the nearest future, once we have helped you through this conflict, that Ukraine will join NATO, right? Secondly, look, I'm not going to comment on a sovereign state's decisions or what it wants to do or needs to do to defend itself. You know, Britain is a nuclear weapons state. I'm not going to sit here and be hypocritical, but I also know the best thing I could do is stay on this stage, do this, this, and this, and President Putin will lap it up and say, you see, all along my fears are correct. You know, people are going to threaten Russia and et cetera, and that is not a game I'm going to play for President Putin, okay? So I also think that, look, you're right on the Budapest Memorandum, right? You're right in Minsk, okay? And, you know, I think one of the reasons the international community is so determined to help Ukraine be successful and Russia be defeated in this conflict is partly to right some of the wrongs, okay? I mean, I can't turn back time. I wish I had a time machine, okay? And I'm sure if Ukraine had a time machine, they probably wouldn't have turned up in Budapest, right? They would have said, tough, right? But remember, we have watched Putin go on a journey. Now, some of you in this room from Eastern Europe would have said he was always going to be like that, right? And some of you who know Russia better than I will ever know Russia will say that's what Russia is. But for many people in the West, they watch Putin go on a journey, and his journey has ended up where he is now. And I think there were, I mean, I even remember Putin muting whether he might want to join NATO back in the early 2000s, right? So luckily he didn't. But I think that journey led people to make decisions that I think we either regret or he has now himself reneged on. And he's the one who's broken the Budapest, effectively, agreement. But ultimately, you know, I don't think you should doubt that this NATO summit is all about helping Ukraine win in Ukraine against Russia, defeating Russia in Ukraine, and giving Ukraine the security it requires for its future to be prosperous and successful.
Okay, well, we are out of time, so thank you all so much for being here.
15 minutes, great.
15 minutes, yeah.
If you could all, is my microphone on? Yes? Okay. If you could all take your seats, please. We've got a tight 15 minutes because the NATO-Ukraine Council is about to begin. And I know everyone in the audience has some interesting things that they would love to have answered by the two of you. So Andrei Yermak, Mr. Yermak, how wonderful to see you. Minister Landsbergis, I was talking to the minister, and because the council's about to start, and because of the bravery, courage that you've shown Ukraine, we actually think we're going to throw protocol to the wind and turn first to you. And I wonder if you could talk about, I was with you not so long ago, a few weeks ago, with President Zelensky in his office during a time of attacks. And President Zelensky said if he didn't get what he wanted at the NATO summit, that he wouldn't come because he would consider it a betrayal to the Ukrainian people. So he came. He hasn't got entirely what we wanted. We read that in his Twitter feed. Give us your feeling of why he decided to come. And then some people argue the communique was a prudent outcome. NATO doesn't want to go to war with Ukraine. Others call it a missed opportunity. I'd love to have your view.
Thank you very much. First of all, of course, the President Zelensky, President of Ukraine, come to Vilnius because it's important to be here and to be the partners, to be the alliance. And first of all, the unity of NATO and support which we really received during these more than 500 days of this war. It's a very, very strong signal to the aggressor that, first of all, that alliance and the partners not just believe, they sure about our victory. The second, let's see, it's today it's not finished, and we are looking for some very serious results of the summit. And of course, our president, he's a very principled person. And of course, everything which he said before and our estimate and our feelings, you can listen, you can see. He is very honest. He is always very clear, declared, and the position of our country. But let's see, we really will have in several minutes starting this very important, I think the maybe most important for Ukraine meetings, the NATO alliance, in which we will discuss, first of all, of course, the continue of the military aids, which very important for us to win this war. And of course, we will continue, and I hope it will be today, one very important moment for the security guarantees for Ukraine in the way to be a member of the NATO.
And just a quick follow-up then on that, in this balance between prudent outcome, missed opportunity, are you saying it all depends how things go from now? Because if you had listened to President Zelensky's or read President Zelensky's tweet from yesterday, where he's calling the language about Ukraine and NATO absurd, it seems to me that this is a movement in another direction now.
I hope that this summit not will be missed the opportunity, but once again, you can everything listen and see in the results of this day. We have very positive bilateral meeting already with some partners, and they look this, the positives of the results of this summit.
Thank you. And then just finally, how has it been received in Ukraine thus far?
Sorry?
This summit and the outcomes. How are Ukrainians receiving this and responding to it inside Ukraine?
What's the mood in Ukraine about?
Mood in Ukraine.
You know, we have more than 100 days of war. And you know, all us in Ukraine, we are living in very specific reality, the reality of the war. And of course, Ukrainians looking for this summit and for the results in some very concrete things. And of course, you know, and these seconds, these minutes, our heroes continue to fighting. And this is, you know, for us, it's sometimes these days, it's the very special atmosphere, because here a peace, here the silence, here's not you listen, not listen, the sirens, and you personally, and my colleague and friends personally was and can see this reality in Ukraine. But, you know, our nations show all these 500 days that how we are brave, how it's possible to not be afraid, how it's possible to fight for independence, for freedoms. And of course, we hope that today's results of this summit will be more inspired and give for emotional and very important, not just emotional, some very practical support of our people, for our soldiers to go forward. And I'd like to say very important things, that we not stopping our fightings. No exist any force which can make us stop us till we liberated all our territories, we back all our people, and really win this war. And I'm absolutely sure that it will be our joint victory.
So,
Mr. Yermak, I think that's a great transition to the Prime Minister. Having been with you recently in Kiev, I slept a lot better at night because of Patriot missiles. Here I can sleep well at night, not because of the Patriot missiles that are out there right now for your airport. Mr. Landsbergis, I followed your history a long time. I was here when you were in the Warsaw Pact and in the final days, and at the time of the Vilnius 10, ahead of your 2004 membership. Talk about this summit in that context, in the context of history, but also how you think history might remember this summit.
Well, that's an excellent question. We tend to look at Vilnius and Vilnius summits in a way that they sometimes do not offer a tactical change, but they offer a strategic opportunity. And it happened in 2014 when tactically at that day some of us felt that we might not have won the day, but at the end we won Ukraine, and Ukraine has won. I believe that something of that sort is happening these days, that somebody might have expected. Quite a lot of those here in this room and in this country expected more. That happened today, but I think that's in strategy, strategically, we won. We committed ourselves to Ukrainian membership in NATO. That's the biggest achievement, I would say, strategically. Now, where the problem lies, the way that I look at the history back. In the promise in Bucharest, even though it was a strong statement, Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. It was a strong statement. The problem was not with the statement itself. It was with our lack of commitment afterwards. We did not come back. We came back to the statement 3 invasions later. That was a problem. So now I'm quite sure that we're committed, that we won't waste another year, another month, and another day staying on the question and doing everything in our power so that we stay true to the meaning that we put into the declaration. And that means, to sum up, that means that Vilnius summit was not the last stop. We have to see it as a bridge. And the next stop is Washington. So we still have a full year, lots to do, and I count on every single one of you to do your part so that Washington can actually be even more historic than Vilnius.
Thank you for that. And it being the 75th anniversary, I hope that's true. A follow-up question on that. Some say the actual communique language, because of how conditional it was made, is weaker than 2008 in Bucharest. But am I interpreting weaker language but stronger commitment toward the goal?
Yeah, I think that I was not there in the room in 2008, unfortunately, so I've just read about it and I was told about it. I think that the way it is being presented, that the consensus in 2008 was weaker. Mm-hmm. It was not there. Now it's much wider, definitely. You don't see an objection, from the people in the room who would say, Ukraine should not be part of NATO. We cannot commit ourselves to that idea. There's nobody saying that. Mm-hmm. So that is a step forward. Again, coming from Eastern flank, we tend to see the situation a tiny bit different. A tiny bit different. And for us, actually, the history has changed since the last year. That's why our wording is stronger. That's why our stance is stronger. That's why our support to Ukraine, is more vocal, because for us the history runs a different course right now. And I tend to use the example of Berlin Wall. I think it's a very monumental time in European history, in world history, in 1989. So for us, last year, the wall has been rebuilt, or it's being rebuilt. So basically, in that principle, we're back into. For us, it's Cold War. For Ukraine, it's Hot War. But we're back in 1989 and going backwards. So this is where our mentality is. This is how we see the situation. And therefore, we are building on a different reality than it was in 2008.
So we all know that an alliance has to balance the long term and the short term. We also know that even, and Jake Sullivan was talking about that earlier today, unity doesn't mean you don't disagree. And press reports have it that at least 8 countries of the 31 were fighting very hard for different language, stronger language toward invitation for Ukraine. Can you, to the extent you can, where is the alliance unified? Where is it ununified? What is the crux of the differences in the room?
I would say in some cases, the horizon is, there is difference in horizon. We tend to see that the problems that we are trying to solve, the way that we're helping Ukraine, the way that Ukraine should be helped, we're talking decades of a new reality in Europe. Decades of Putin, who is still in power, who will be a dangerous neighbor, who might attack again, who might assault other neighbors, even try Article 5, how that works. We are thinking in this term. It might not happen next year. In some cases, the horizon is way shorter, way shorter. We're talking years. In some cases, it's months. How do we survive this month? How do we survive till next year? How do we survive till next election?
And then, very briefly, then, your answer to the question of prudent outcome, missed opportunity.
I'm talking about the bridge.
Yeah, that's a good one. The one more question for you, then I want to go back to Mr. Yermak. The Baltic Aerospace Agreement. In all the reporting about everything else, very little has been placed on this. And then put that in the context of Swedish membership. Obviously, this was the big success of this week, and in many cases, in many respects, unanticipated. Put together this Baltic Aerospace Agreement, the Swedish membership. How does that change your region? How does it change security around the Baltics and Lithuania?
Well, I think that Swedish membership is monumental. Definitely, if we remain on the example of a bridge, so it's a pillar. definitely. It's a very strong pillar, and you know, the way that we frame it currently, the promise of swift accession, Swedish swift accession has been made, and now we're very much looking forward to it. But it changes the situation in the Baltic Sea dramatically. It affects defense plans that are being voted for, that are adopted, but it changes them as well. Sweden is a very strong element in all of our defense, not just Lithuania, but also Poland. Also, I mean, I'm not even talking about Sweden itself, but also Finland, also Estonia. The whole Baltic Sea, you know, becomes a different concept. That's a very strong thing. When it comes to the air defense, we're saying that, look, we have to talk about the content. Things don't happen overnight, so it's a very strong step forward. But now we will be looking for, you know, how it will be materialized.
Thank you for that, Mr. Yermak. So not a prudent outcome, not a missed opportunity, but a bridge. What would you like to see this week's events in Vilnius be a bridge to on behalf of Ukraine? What you talked about Washington? What do you hope will happen between now and Washington? And obviously, we have a spring offensive we're talking about at the same time. So there are two battles. One of them very real and on the front lines for Ukraine against the aggressor Putin's troops, and the other is the bureaucratic contest in NATO, where we want to land by next summer in Washington.
First of all, I hope that during this period of time, we will win this war. This will be, first of all, the most important for us, and I'm sure it will be very important for all the world. The second, of course, as we're looking during this way and to the Washington summit, of course, we will receive the fixed security guarantees, because the security guarantees to Ukraine, it's the guarantees of the security of the whole Europe. And as I said, we hope that just today we will have very important stage of issue of this security. And of course, I'm agreed with my colleagues that we are looking as a bridge, and we hope that, you know, during these 500 days, Ukraine a lot of times surprised everybody in the world. First of all, we are surprised then it started these invasions, and somebody gave to us 3 days, 1 week, 1 month. We are surprised, and we still not just defended, we liberated our lands. The second, you remember about then the President Zelensky, Speaker of the Parliament, the head of the government, sent the documents for the candidate states. Many people was very skeptical. We already received the status. We talking about coalitions of air jets. We're talking about coalition of tanks. We're talking about the coalitions of air defense. Already it's reality. And I think that we try everything from our side to will surprise and Washington. And of course, we are looking finally, as how said Mr. President Erdogan in the last meeting with President Zelensky in Istanbul, that Ukraine have everything to be a member of the NATO. And of course, we believe in it. And I'm glad that today I think nobody in the world just don't think that it's happened. Of course, we're looking for the perspective, for the future, but not hesitation that it's happened.
So, Mr. Yermak, final
and
question.
about, I'm sorry, about your second part of the the reforms and, you know, in the beginning, then the Vladimir Zelensky go for the presidential campaign in 2019. One of his priority was the reforms of Ukraine. It's, I can say, it's in our blood. And of course, I can say that maybe it will be difficult to find another country in the world who just, in the circumstances of this terrible war, not stopping any reforms. And we go forward, and I think many people, and Ursula von der Leyen and the European leaders many times said how really impressed by the reforms which we continue doing just during this war.
So, final question. We've run out of time. So, final question for each of you, Mr. Yermak and then Minister Landsbergis. You have said, President Zelensky has said, that strategic commitments can't replace NATO membership. Do you still believe that? Strategic support.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Okay. Yes, of course. Of course, it's, you know, we are living in so rhythm of life that immediately back to Ukraine, we continue to do all the best from our side. That just if somebody have some hesitations in the colleagues, there is no exist, and to do and go forward and not stopping, because this is the goal and this is the decisions of Ukrainian society. Today, more than 90% of Ukrainians supported and believe that very soon Ukraine will be the members of the NATO.
Thank you, Mr. Yermak. Mr. Landsbergis, the bridge, Vilnius to Washington. How should that bridge be built?
I think that there are some very practical steps that could be taken and should be taken. First of all, there was a discussion about the need for additional reforms in Ukraine. At least this is what allies agreed upon. And Ukraine has shown tremendous, unbelievable capacity to reform under duress. This has happened on the path to EU. So I think that if concrete requirements are being presented to Ukraine, I'm absolutely 100% convinced that Ukraine will deliver on those, so that we could have, to show up for the allies that, because the statement goes that when allies agree and the conditions are met. So I'm sure that Ukraine can deliver on part of conditions.
So an invitation in Washington would be potentially possible, would be possible.
I'm convinced that it could be historic, not just because of the years.
I think that's a good spot to end on. So let me thank Mr. Yermak, not just for being here, but for the courage of your country, and please send our best wishes to President Zelensky and all Ukrainians. And then Minister Landsbergis, what wonderful hosts you've been, and what an incredibly well executed and organized summit we've been taken care of so well here by every citizen of this country. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.